The Carpenter and the Cradle, a History Weaver Adventure, Book 1, by Connie Worden. Read by the author. Chapter 6. The old cherry barn, as the locals called it, historically belonged to the Cherry family, but none of them had lived in Beaver Row for years. The old house on the property had been torn down. It had fallen into disrepair after Old Man Cherry had died, and his only daughter hadn't wanted to pay for the upkeep that would have been more than the house was likely to be worth. The property had been for sale at one time, but Lila Brower, the old man's daughter, had apparently given up on selling it. It was still in the family, but for all intents and purposes was abandoned land. The barn on the property, however, had been built to last. It had outlived the house and was still in good shape. But no one would be likely to bother her if a stray girl were to camp out in it. No doubt it was the cherry barn that Georgie was planning to make her temporary home. The odds were good that no one would ever discover her living there as long as she kept a low profile, and neither June nor July gave away her secret. It wasn't a bad choice for a makeshift inn for the vagabond girl. It would keep the weather out, for now. While it was still summer, the spare quilt June had rounded up for Georgie would keep her warm enough, even in the cool nights of the mountain valley that was Beaver Row. But what if Georgie hadn't figured out a more permanent solution by wintertime? The old barn had no insulation and no heat source. It would be slightly warmer than being out in the snow, but only slightly. Still, June supposed there was no sense in worrying about winter when summer had barely hit full stride. Anything could have happened by winter. All she needed to be concerned about for the moment was making sure Georgie stayed safe and had everything she needed. Getting her food supply together every week was sure to be a challenge. But Georgie was counting on her. She couldn't disappoint her. Co used all his recent training, preparing for attaining manhood, to calm his body and his mind. There had to be something he could do. For now, he'd quit struggling and relax. Maybe his lack of resistance would put the men slightly off their guard, and Co could have the advantage of taking them by surprise if an opportune moment arose to try again for an escape. It seemed much later, but probably wasn't, when Co saw that opportunity out in front of him. They're heading for the crossing tree, Co suddenly realized, as the men changed directions from marching parallel to the river to veering towards it, and making their way down a gentle downhill slope. Co craned his neck around to see the river shining in the moonlight, and the shape of a massive trunk spanning the breadth of the ravine that narrowed at that point. All at once, Co knew where he was. Finally! How many times had he and Kwa or Hitot or Bidi or Hab jumped from the height of this natural bridge into the river below? On a hot summer day, too many to count. It was a spot where the top of the ravine was not far off of the water, and the water was especially deep in the middle. It was probably only 4 of Co's body lengths above the river, and from the middle of the bridge, good fun for a jump and a splash and a swim. It would be tricky. Co was still tied hand and foot, but he could swim like a fish. He was sure he could ride the river downstream to the boys' landing point, the spot where they hauled themselves out of the river to make their way back upstream by foot, to jump from the bridge and do it all over again. He could hold his breath longer than any of his friends and swim underwater for an age. By the time he surfaced, his captors would be sure to think he had drowned and give up looking for him. Of course, odds were that they would be right. If he chose the wrong moment or was delayed too long in throwing himself off the bridge, he would just as easily hit a rock in the shallower part of the water and meet his end that way. But better a death of honor trying to escape than a death of disgrace at the hands of the enemy. It was by far his best chance, probably his only one. "Christopher, come here," Fern said to her little brother. She tried to keep her voice even and cheerful. 3-year-old Christopher Wu happily climbed aboard the lap she pulled him into. He seemed blissfully unaware of the sounds of angry voices being raised in the room next door to Fern's bedroom. She couldn't tune them out, however. She'd had too much experience listening to them over the years. When her mom had still been with her dad, Gary Chung, she'd heard plenty of the yelling. It hadn't ended well. Her parents had split up when she was about Christopher's age. But her parents had never been married, the reason she still wore her mom's maiden name. When Fern was 6, Joanna Mann had moved to Beaver Row to be with the new man in her life, Tim Wu, and they had eventually married. Tim had been more of a father to her than had her biological father, who Fern had seen seldom in the intervening years. She'd hoped the marriage Joanna and Tim entered into before Christopher's birth would keep the couple together. But she was afraid the pattern was repeating itself with her mom and Tim. They'd had Christopher and appeared happy enough to the outside world, but the battles at home were familiar territory to Fern. Whatever problems Joanna had had with Gary, she seemed to carry over into her marriage with Tim. The fighting had been going on for years, from the start, but lately it seemed to be getting worse. Fern felt cold all over as she listened to the snide tones of Joanna's cutting remarks and Tim's voice raised. She couldn't hear exactly what Joanna was saying, but she'd heard enough of her mom's fault-finding to have a pretty good idea of the kinds of things Joanna would be saying. No one ever quite seemed to live up to her very high expectations. No one but Christopher, who was practically perfect in her eyes, for now. Fern was genuinely fond of Tim, but mainly she was afraid for Christopher. She didn't want him to grow up barely knowing his daddy, starting over with some new man in Joanna's life. Christopher was so little, sweet and innocent. If only he could stay that way, at least a little longer. If only Fern could protect him from life in ways that no one had been there to protect her from life. Since she was 11 and Christopher was born, she'd felt responsible for him. He'd depended on her. It gave her a stabbing sensation right through her chest to imagine ever letting him down. But she knew there was only so much she could do to keep him from life's hurts. "Do you want a story, Christopher?" she asked, her voice just a little louder than normal, trying to keep the next room's sounds from infiltrating the security of her bedroom. "Yeah, tell me a story, Fun. Please tell me the one about the little boy named Christopher." Christopher had also inherited her slight speech impediment, and the name Fun lived on. "Which one? All my stories are about a little boy named Christopher." "I don't care which one. I like them all." "Okay, well, here's a new one. You haven't heard this one before. It's about how a little boy named Christopher jumped with both feet into a puddle one rainy day, and the puddle swallowed him." "Why come?" "Because it was such a deep puddle. It went down, 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 until the little boy named Christopher was in over his head. But you know what then? He kept on going down, 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 and when he finally landed with the ground under his feet, he was in a whole new world. It wasn't very much like this world. In that world, people walked upside down. Because the earth is round, you see, so the people on the other side of it, where the little boy named Christopher landed, walked around on the upside-down side of the world. So the first thing Christopher had to learn how to do was to walk around upside down." And away Fern disappeared into a world of her own. A world of stories and the imagination that had never quite left her since her earliest days. It came in handy when she needed to distract Christopher. He always loved the stories that jumped into her head without her bidding and rolled off her tongue without effort. It was a good thing for Fern that she only needed to devote half her mind to the story she was telling Christopher. The other half was busy churning over and over with the thought that she didn't know what they'd all do if her mom ended up in a divorce. Would her mom find a new man and move them to a new place again? It had been traumatic when shy and sensitive little Fern had been ripped away from her father and her grandparents and the city that was the only world she'd known up until the age of 6, to move to a strange place where they'd had to start over with a new man who was a stranger to her. But Beaver Row was home now, and Tim was her new father. As traumatic as her uprooting had been at 6, it seemed much more an event to be dreaded now, 8 years later. But it also seemed very likely. The memories drifted one by one on the heels of the other, through Fern's brain as her soothing story voice droned on with the words that completely absorbed Christopher. Too bad she couldn't lose herself in them the same way. But they weren't enough distraction for her from all the things she didn't want to think about. Halfway into a story that she had no idea how to end, the ring of her bedroom phone close to her head caused her to nearly dump Christopher off her lap. She looked at the call display screen. It was the bookshop's number, June or July. Definitely a call she wanted to take. Maybe there was news about Georgie and where she'd be going after she had to leave Lady Cromarty's. "Hey, fun! You'll never guess what," June's voice said. "Well, you'd better tell me then." "Georgie's gone. She wasn't anywhere to be found when Lady Cromarty woke up this morning." "What? Tell me more. What do you know?" Fern said. "I can't tell you any more about that situation, just that Georgie's gone and they don't know where she's gone to. But here's something else. You know the old cherry barn? There's a family, I think they're related to Old Man Cherry, planning to fix it up and turn it into a house and live in it. I met one of the daughters this afternoon when I was biking by and saw the family outside kicking around a soccer ball. I went over to find out what was going on and heard all this. The girl I met, her name is Coral. Coral Lyons. I think she's Old Man Cherry's great-granddaughter or something. And she's 15, just our age. Well, my age. Almost your age. In another 2 months, anyway." "Well, that's news." Forgetting her family trouble and Christopher and the story she was partway through, Fern settled back for a good round of gossip with her best friend.